Hi everyone. So the features of word stress that I'm going to raise awareness about in my lesson are conjugation, linking, and assimilation. So first of all, to raise awareness of these things. So first of all, what I like to do is using the lexical chunks of advice, which I'm going to be using you had better, why don't you, and you ought to. Now, to raise awareness for these things, I want to focus on an activity involving a person called Mr. Lazy. Now, obviously, Mr. Lazy, of course, needs advice. And so, for example, he should get a job, or he should clean the flat, or he should eat fresh food, which is something which I would have done before. Now, focusing on the pronunciation of the lexical chunks. Firstly, I would say these words individually. So, you had better, you ought to, why don't you? So these words will obviously be on the board behind me. And then I want to focus on mixing the primary stress of these words. So for example, you had better and you had better. Or you ought to, or why don't you, or why don't you. Now I want to do this to raise awareness of stress patterns to formulate different meanings of a sentence. So obviously if I'm saying why don't you, I'm focusing on you. So to do that I would put circles, bigger to smaller circles, on conjuncting words. So for example, why don't you? You would have the bigger circle and the other words would have the smaller conjoined circles. So that's first of all to raise awareness of stress patterns. Then to practice, what I like to do is with all the three sentences on the board, which would be, for example, you had better get a job, or why don't you clean the flat, or you ought to eat fresh food. They'll be on the board. And then for this, I would get a line of individual students, preferably 6, because there's 6 words. And then to do this, to practice this, they would all say each word of the sentence. So for example, you had better eat fresh food. And then I would go faster and slower, depending on this. So for example, you had better, but then obviously there's a conjugation there, because you had becomes you'd. So using my hands, I would show that you had would become you'd. And then, furthermore, I want to focus on how the utterance is, for example, of the chunk. So you had better becomes you'd better. Now, a potential problem with this, obviously, with my accent, I use a glottal. So the potential problem would be students not understanding the glottal. So for this, I would write the phonetic script of this sentence on the board and showing how it would change from you had better to you'd better. And I would do that also for why don't you. So obviously when you conjugate them words, when you say the words fluently as a speaker, why don't you, you assimilate the t and you assimilate the t and the y to become a ch. So why don't you? Why don't you? Why don't you? Why don't you? So again, I'll show how these words can change from 3 just to 1 utterance. And again, I will show that on the board written behind me. And I would get students as well, as we're saying these sentences, for example, you had better, you'd better. Or one I want to focus on in particular is you ought to. The linking of the you and the or becomes you ought to. So there's a W sound now. So you ought becomes you ought. You ought to do something. So I would do that, and again with students helping me do it, of course, you know. So I say you ought, you ought, you ought to. So doing that, the students become aware and practice saying this type of sentence by saying it quicker, you ought to, and slower, you ought to. And the reason I'm doing that, the faster and slower, is so students can hear the differences between the fast and the slow pronunciation, and also it will help students in terms of listening, because obviously students have a big problem with listening to people say you ought to, and a native speaker saying you ought to. So this is predominantly just for the listening activity. Finally, the support activity would be using the words I have on the board. Obviously there'll be 6 of them. You ought to get a job. 6. We'll show how it can be shortened when you speak. You ought to becomes 1 utterance. So now instead of having 6 words, we now have 4 words. You ought to get a job. And obviously the vowel reduction as well. With you ought to, the long vowel now becomes a schwa. You ought to. So I want to focus that, and the reason I want to do that is to heighten awareness of how many words are in a sentence for a student, so again hoping they're listening, and also to heighten their awareness of the vowel reduction. When we have a long vowel, it instead becomes a schwa sound, so you ought to instead of you ought to, because to say that fluently, I believe anyway, like if I try to say you ought to, it sounds a bit forced, whereas you say it like normally when you reduce the longer vowels to a schwa, you ought to, sounds more fluent. So you ought to get a job, or you had better eat fresh food, or you had better shower. With Mr. Lazy, I'm guessing he doesn't shower. So that's my idea, and I'm looking forward to your advice, please, guys. Thanks very much.